So hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and this is not a reading vlog. This is not a cooking show. This is just me making dinner while talking to you about what I recently read. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is Candide, and I just recently finished this. I did a buddy read with this with a couple of different people from my channel. We had a great time talking about it on the story graph. If you would still like to read this book and share your thoughts on the story graph and read our thoughts and reactions, that is still up. I will put the link for it down in the description box below. But let me tell you what Candide is about. Candide is a young man who is growing up in an idealistic kingdom. That is until one day he finds he is now out in the world all on his own due to a variety of circumstances, shall we say. This story is a satire and it discusses the philosophical idea that was popular at the time that Voltaire was alive, this idea that was basically known as optimism. Let me talk about what some of the highs were in the book as I get my cornbread ready to go in the oven. So one of the highs in the book was that it was very fast-paced. I was surprised how fast-paced this book is. I mean, in all fairness, it's not a particularly long book, but regardless of that, it was just really well paced throughout, despite this idea of like philosophy in it. There were parts of the satire that were almost farce like because there were just really crazy things going on. The book is really well plotted and it really covers a lot in such a short period of time. In some ways, I'm almost thankful the book is not longer because I don't know how many other people he could have possibly skewered. I'm just glad I wasn't alive at the time of Voltaire because, like, talk about name dropping people and instantly roasting them in a very savage manner. Like, that is pretty much what the book is from beginning to end. And if you get a book with at least some notes in it, it'll help you realize just how much he's talking about the people around him. There's one point in Candide where I feel like Voltaire is just relentlessly going after different people in his society that he cannot stand. Like, he is just not going to give up. He's going to use every single moment in this book to go after them. But I feel like in the middle of this moment, you get a really clear idea of like just the different things that he's trying to attack. One of the characters says, imagine all the contradictions, all the inconsistencies possible, and you may meet them in the government, the courts of justice, the churches, and the public spectacles of this odd nation. Well, thanks to this book, you don't need to leave anything to your imagination. Like, you get examples of all of that throughout the book in a very humorous way, which I find impressive given that there's so many years between when this book was written and today. There are still things in it that you find funny, possibly because like there's universal problems that have not gone away since the writing of this. Rather concerning. So there are lows in this book, and I think for me, probably the biggest low in this book is that even though he's talking about the problems with everyone else around him, I also felt like this was a case of the ignoring your own issues, because there is definitely a moment where he is characterizing other people in another country, and it ceases to be satire in this moment, where he really just describes people in Africa and starts talking about people of other nations. And there's definitely like, hey, your racism's showing here. So while he criticizes um, the slave movement and even abolitionists in some ways for how they are not addressing that, at the same time he's unaware of his own biases, and it shows in what ends up being written at different moments in the book. So that was definitely something that was very disappointing to see. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about, I think a great place to get an idea of some of Voltaire's broader views, other than just looking at like his essays and nonfiction writing, would be a particular scene in James by Percival Everett, where he actually talks in more detail about some of the thoughts of Voltaire. And if you've read the book, you'll know exactly the point I'm talking about. And if you haven't, I don't really think that's a spoiler, so you'll just have to read it to find out what I'm talking about. At the end of the day, I surprisingly still gave this book 4 or 5 stars. Why do I never check beforehand? I'll put up on the screen, which you may be surprised at, given that he definitely had some serious biases coming out in this book. but it is a book that I would read again because I do think it's a great example of satire. So, this is a book that I would recommend to anyone who was interested in just learning more about what satire is and looks like, as well as someone who was interested in sort of like an introduction to classics or philosophy. Just be warned that there is some content in there for sure that is going to make you uncomfortable and feel awkward, including the treatment of women throughout the book. Okay, so the second book that I finished this week is Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And this book I listened to almost completely on audiobook. And that was because I started the book and I was like, oh, this is going to be a lot of politics in this book. And I just wasn't feeling the writing style. So I ended up switching to audiobook because sometimes that'll help me continue to work through a book that I at least want to know what the story is about, even if I'm not enjoying every moment of it. So that was my approach with this book, and it worked pretty well. I was able to finish the book. So, what is Barchester Towers about? Well, I'm not going to share in detail because it is the second book in the Barchester Chronicles, and I think that's like a 6-book series. And since this is book 2, I don't want to give away too much, even though the first sentence gives away a lot. But at the end of the day, this is also another satire that covers basically the life and times and petty dramas that occur in a small Victorian cathedral town. So that is basically the setup of this book. But before I tell you more, I'm going to get my chili started. Okay, I'm a little bit in the shadow, but we'll just work with what we've got. The food is cooking on the oven, the meat is browning. So let me real quickly tell you about my thoughts on Barchester Towers. So there were definitely some highs for me. There was some good drama throughout the book, and I am a girl who loves some good drama in her books. However, I did find that I had more lows in this book than I had highs. So, probably for me, the biggest low I ended up finding wasn't actually the politics that were in the book. I have learned that I'm not a huge fan of a lot of politics in my book. And I actually figured out while reading this book why I'm not a huge fan of that. And the reason is because in order to have your main conflict in a book be politics, 9 times out of 10, I find that authors use miscommunication as the trope or plot device to help keep the tension and the politics and the fighting going on. And that was for sure what was going on in Barchester Towers from beginning to end. And I also found this to be true in The Warden, which was book 1. It was just miscommunication or interrupting each other so that you couldn't hear what the other person had to say. But it was just intentional moments in the plot where things continued to be in conflict and people continued to be in conflict for no other reason that they wouldn't listen to one another. And while I can get that here and there in a moment, in a scene, it was something that was clearly intentional choice by the author as well as just prevalent. Like literally they'd be having conversations where it would be like, oh, hey, here's a moment to clear the air, and they would just interrupt each other or assume they knew what the other person was thinking or saying or whatever, and the entire book just went on in that method. So if you like a miscommunication trope, if you don't mind people like misunderstanding one another, then this is the book and maybe the series for you. Personally, it's something I don't like in any book. And so it drove me crazy. And I find that that is usually the way the plot of a political novel is worked out is by having people miscommunicate and not talk to one another and get interrupted so that they can't, work things out in that moment. And to me, it just felt very forced. And so I didn't like it for that reason, despite the fact that there was a lot of humor and a lot of wit throughout the book. And there is even a moment in the book where the author interrupts, which I've heard is like a favorite thing for Anthony Trollope to do, is to interrupt what's going on in his story to share his thoughts. And he says something along the lines, and I couldn't go back because I was on audiobook and find the quote, but he literally has a moment where he says in the book, like, and they could have cleared this up if they just had have shared how they thought, or they had just, stopped interrupting each other or something like that. But they didn't. And of course they didn't, because if they did that, everything would have been resolved, and where would be the rest of my story? So he's aware of what he's doing and he does it constantly, and I did not like it. Barchester Towers, yeah, it ended up being a 3 for me, which is kind of disappointing. I was really excited to find a new classic author, a new Victorian author that I was going to want to follow. I've heard that a lot of his books are like this, and I'm still just not sure. So the next book in the series is book 3. It's Dr. Thorne. If anything, I might get it from the library and or do audio again, but I just don't know if I want to continue the series, which is a shame because I own a couple of the later books in the series. I found them at used bookstores, but it was just okay. It was a 3, like somewhere in the low 3s for me. And yeah, that was rather disappointing. All right, so that brings me to what I'm currently reading, and what I am currently reading includes The Soul of Black Folks. This is by W.E.B. DuBois, and I'm going to get interrupted by the cornbread and my husband coming home, and he's going to be like, what are you doing in the kitchen? Anyway, The Souls of Black Folk is a collection of essays that W.E.B. DuBois wrote post-Reconstruction in the U.S., as he explored the South and really met and talked about and explored just the everyday life and inner workings of African Americans at the time. And this was something that had not been done up to this point, and he has a series of essays that got collected into this book. So I definitely want to talk about one of the essays that I read in here that I really had a lot of thoughts on. I read the essay called Of the Quest of the Golden Fleece, and this was a really interesting essay. There were a couple of other ones that I read as well, but this was the main one that I wanted to talk about. And basically, this essay covers the idea of him going and sort of looking at the state of post-Reconstruction Black farm laborers. So they went from being slaves in the South and working cotton fields to what these Black field laborers are doing today. And sorry if there's a lot of humming in the background. I have some stuff heating up in the microwave. So in fact, that's probably going to beep any second now. Oh no, I still got 3 minutes. I'm good. Okay, so yeah, so this essay was really provocative because he just talks about sort of where people are at this moment, and where the African American community is at this moment. And he talks about just the different situations that people are going through at this time, and why things are kind of falling apart in their community, why people are seeing that there's more, according to this day and time, like promiscuity going on, why families are falling apart, why there's not as many people getting married, and that kind of thing. Ideas that I was like, oh, this sounds familiar, in terms of people saying, hey, why is this happening in this community? And he has this quote that he makes. This is no sudden development, nor the fruit of emancipation. It is the plain heritage from slavery. And then he spends the rest of this essay drawing that connection between where they're at, both socially, mentally, physically, economically, where Black people are, and why they are at that point, even though they are now free, even though they've been emancipated, even though they can now, in theory, own land. And he talks about how this doesn't have to do with their own laziness or their own lack of desire to get ahead or that kind of thing, but he connects to their condition the centuries of slavery and how that impacts people and what was going on during Reconstruction and after they were set free. And, I think you could go into Jim Crow and what was going on before the Civil Rights Movement, during the Civil Rights Movement. I really think you could tie this all the way to today. And I think if W.E.B. Du Bois was alive, he would. So that was a very fascinating and I think very relevant and timely essay to read. And I really enjoyed it. And I will see if I can find an online version of it. And if so, I will link that in the description box below. So pretty much everything is done and I am starving. I will try and make sure to remember, hopefully, to take a picture of my finished plate of food in case you care. But while my husband is getting ready to come to the dinner table, I will finish up talking about the last few books that I am reading, hopefully with no interruptions at this point. So the other book that I am reading and continuing is The Mysteries of Paris, and I am 1 chapter away from the end of this book. In fact, I think I am like less than 10 pages away from finishing this book. Let's see. Let me check. This book ends on page 1363, and I am on page 1351, and it is the last page in this book. I have been reading this book, I think, since February. I'm going to actually have to go back and look. I'll put on the screen how long Stormy and I have been buddy reading this. But I am on the final chapter, and man, this book has taken I don't even know if a turn is the right place to say, but I have so many conflicted feelings that I was not expecting to be feeling at this point, this late in the book. And I'm ready to read this chapter. Like I'm going to eat dinner, and then this is the first thing that I'm doing after dinner because I want to know how it ends. And I cannot say that I have felt that way throughout this book. There are parts when in this book Eugene Sue sticks to the storyline that he has created that are really good. You get invested in the characters. You spend a lot of time with them. How could you not? But there's other things about his writing style and choices that he made because it was serialized, and he's kind of having a conversation with his audience that I fully appreciate why he is sort of getting up on his soapbox when he does. I just hate the way he's unable to do it without completely just sort of breaking up his own story. So that's definitely going to affect my rating on this, but we've got to see how this last chapter goes. The final book that I am working on is 4321 by Paul Auster, and I have to admit, let me see if I can stand in slightly better lighting. Nope, not really. I have to admit, this book really surprised me. I tried picking this up once or twice before. I think I either got it on my TBR or was thinking about putting it on my TBR or just needed another book to read. I don't remember. But both the other times I tried to read this book, I did not enjoy how it opened. And I just had a hard time getting along with the writing style. His syntax is very loose. Like I would argue that he forgot there were periods and replaced 90% of them with commas instead. So you have a lot of chunks of text and blocks of text with it's not a situation where there's no punctuation. Like there is punctuation, which I appreciate, but most of the punctuation is commas. So you have very long sentences. That said, now that I've gotten a bit into the book, it's really working for me. I really like the flow that it creates. I really am enjoying the story that he's telling. And what is that story? I didn't even tell you. So this book is largely about the life of Archibald Isaac Ferguson, who is born on, what's his birthday? It says somewhere, oh, March 3rd, 1947. And we follow his life in 4 different ways. And I'm not going to get into how he structures and sets that up in the book because I do feel like that's kind of fun to figure out and discover on your own. But you are following Archibald and you are learning about what his life is like if he was the same person in every circumstance, but the circumstances around him changed. And it's interesting because there's one point in the book where the character even thinks about this. And he says, "Such an interesting thought," Ferguson said to himself, "to imagine how things could be different for him, even though he was the same. The same boy in a different house with a different tree, the same boy with different parents, the same boy with the same parents who didn't do the same things they did now. What if his father was still a big game hunter, for example, and they all lived in Africa? What if his mother was a famous movie actress and they all lived in Hollywood? What if he had a brother or sister?" I even enjoy the fact that the character himself thinks about this concept. And I think that section of writing is completely what this book is about. What if he was the same person and everything else was potentially different in some way? And I really feel like it's getting to the crux of the idea of who would he end up being at the end of it all? Would he end up growing up into the same person? Because you start at his birth, and in a lot of ways, it's, I guess, a Bildungsroman. It's a coming of age story where you have the same person with different outcomes. So I guess you're also looking at the idea of, nature versus nurture, and which one is going to win out. Is he going to be the same person at the end of all these experiences, no matter what? Or are all these different experiences and the different things around him changing going to impact him? So I would say with these 4 different Archies, if you will, not everything in his life changes, but there are a lot of circumstances that change. And I love exploring that idea. I would argue that this is probably a work of speculative fiction in that sense. And yeah, I'm happy that I gave this book a second, third, and fourth try. That's it. So dinner is ready. Let me take you over. I'll show you the chili in the pot, and I'll put up at some point on the screen a picture of what my meal looked like. And yeah, that's it for me. And I will talk to you later. Happy reading and have a great dinner if it's dinner time for you. Bye. Oh my gosh, yes. Anybody else hungry? because I am ready to eat. Hubby may be on his own. Yum. Bon appetit.